This program is brought to you by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.
Hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. Hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. Hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. Oh my Lord, what shall I do?
Okay, my name is Richard Yarborough. I'm a professor at UCLA and a Stanford alumnus, and I'd like to welcome you to the last of our sessions for today. It's been a great day so far, and I've enjoyed myself and learned a lot, and I think many of you here would say the same thing. This session, session number 4, is the racial politics of the Nadir. And as the other, we will work the same way as the other sessions have worked. For more detailed biographical information, I would refer you to the list of credits and affiliations at the back of your program. And the speakers will make their presentations in the order that they're listed, in which they're listed in the program. First, we'll have James Smethurst, University of Massachusetts. Second speaker will be Jennifer Terry, University of Durham, UK. Our third speaker will be Nicole Waligora-Davis, Cornell, and we'll finish up with Ken Warren, University of Chicago. And again, as we've been doing all day, I would ask you to hold your questions until the end, and then we'll open up. And I've been asked to alert you to the fact that in this same room, at the end of this session, we will have a tea. I don't know if we'll have watercress sandwiches in the whole trip, but maybe something a little more substantial. But the tea will be here, and then there'll be a performance of Dunbar's Children at 5:30, a very close distance from here, and we will have some guides to take us over there. So I think the evening's events will be entertaining as well. So we'll start with James Smethurst.
All right, my paper is allegedly, it's supposed to be about dualism, but it's more like, I guess you would say, intersecting and somewhat contradictory dualisms or dualities in Dunbar. Now, as you all know, and as we've been hearing all day, that the age of Dunbar is a paradoxical moment. The paradox is that Dunbar and his African-American age cohort were the first generation to grow up after emancipation. Unlike his parents who had been slaves, he was born free and grew up after the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Yet as Dunbar and his peers reached maturity as artists and intellectuals in the first half of the 1890s, the hopes and promises of Reconstruction were clearly fading with the increasing advance of Jim Crow and disenfranchisement in the South and elsewhere, despite the fact that those amendments were not repealed but remained part of the Constitution. This legal and political dualism, officially codified by the Supreme Court in Plessy v. Ferguson and Williams v. Mississippi, was mirrored in a similarly double and ambivalent position in the simultaneous emergence of a relatively distinct African-American trans-regional popular culture and of a linked and similarly national mainstream popular culture. Now, the problem of dualism, whether in W.E.B. Du Bois's semi-psychological proposition of two or more unintegrated consciousnesses existing simultaneously in one body, Dunbar's notion of the masking of one's true self with the proto-Althusserian dilemma that Du Bois identifies as only seeing oneself in a social way through the eyes of others who only see the mask, or a more strictly legalistic sense of post-Reconstruction Jim Crow segregation, is the problem of being a citizen and yet not a citizen, and by extension of being legally human and not quite human at the same time in an increasingly urbanized and industrialized United States. How does one respond? Through radical integration or separatism, or through a sort of separate development of a group culture and politics that would enable the group to force itself into the mainstream of culture and power in the United States? And if one tries to represent what one might consider a distinctly African-American subjectivity, what might that be? The folk culture? Who then defines the folk, and how does one allow the folk culture, folk subject to speak? How does one represent and recreate his or her culture without being contaminated by minstrelsy and plantation literature, by popular and so-called high culture appropriation and misappropriation? How does one deal with the doubleness of popular culture, particularly the ambivalence of African-American minstrel-influenced vaudeville? Dunbar engaged these questions most directly in verse written in what Howells described as literary English. The poet in his song, for instance, was among the most consistently performed of these poems in Dunbar's public readings to African-American audiences. The familiar pastoral conceit of the poem is that the artist is a sort of arborist who sings as he works. But after an initial stanza that sets the scene, the following three stanzas each feature a problem, causing the poet-cultivator disappointment, dissatisfaction, and eventually anger and feelings of rebellion. No one acknowledges or praises his songs. He works hard while others dream within the dell. His garden suffers from a strangely malignant drought or rapacious blight. The poet appears able to quell these feelings with a certain cheerful stoicism that many of Dunbar's contemporaries, particularly those writing in the plantation tradition, said was a defining feature of African-American folk psychology. He declares, "And so I sing and all is well." Still, each time the feelings rise higher and the tone of the poet's transition to the calming refrain seems more strained, and by the end near hysterical, so that the reader, much like the speaker of County Cullen's Heritage, wonders if the next rise of passion will overwhelm him entirely or tear him apart, to invoke Du Bois's image in The Souls of Black Folk. That the poet submerges or hides his emotions in apparently cheerful song also recalls Frederick Douglass's famous comments in his autobiographies about the hidden meanings of slave music and how that music is frequently misread or misheard by white auditors. Douglass's remarks about the meaning and reception of slave music are addressed even more directly in A Corn Song, which I was glad to see you got a handout today, which sets the musical expression of exhausted slaves returning to the quarters after a long day of labor in the fields against the music's reception by the master in the seat, who is moved to tears listening to the mellow minor music as the slaves trudge by. That's kind of a nice ring to it, huh? Where the master perceives a moving sweetness, the poem suggests another interpretation on the part of the slaves, a complicated combination of sorrow, endurance, anger, and protest. Like Charles Chestnut's conjure stories, Dunbar's poem directly engages the sort of claim made by Joel Chandler Harris that the songs and stories of the black folk are, quote, a part of the domestic history of every Southern family, unquote, with Southern, as it often does, here meaning white, a sort of claim found in many works in the plantation tradition. Now, Dunbar's poem allows that Harris may be correct, that the song the master hears is no doubt part of the domestic history of the master's family, as well as part of that of the slaves. However, the poem also expresses what should be the obvious point that Douglass, too, makes. There are different communities of meaning based on different histories, or perhaps different locations in the same historical space, though the problem of seeing oneself through the eyes of with a peculiar disposition might remain. Both the poet in his song and A Corn Song raise the complicated masking of the black artist working in minstrelsy, the minstrelsy-influenced tradition of the popular stage, as well as the intersecting popular culture variations of plantation literature that are foregrounded in ways strangely more direct and more oblique in We Wear the Mask. Now, again, as you all know, with the possible exception of Sympathy, We Wear the Mask is almost certainly Dunbar's best known and most anthologized poem today. Formally, it is a fairly straightforward rondeau, an old French lyric that enjoyed a vogue among such English poets as Swinburne, Dobson, and Dowson in the late 19th century. Geoffrey Jacques has provocatively argued that Dunbar's poem is a rewriting and recasting of Thomas Wyatt's rondeau, What Veileth Truth, or By It to Take Pain. However, as Jacques points out, Dunbar modernizes Wyatt's work in a manner that is akin to symbolist poetry and the melancholy symbolist-influenced poetry of Dowson, in a sort of linguistic tour de force that reminds the reader that Dunbar's literary competency stretches at least from Petrarch and the earliest English adaptations of the Petrarchan lyric through to Swinburne, Symonds, Dowson, and a wide range of local and dialect poetry, the coon song, and the popular black theater of his cultural present, not to mention the slave narratives and the African-American literary traditions of the 19th century. This sort of range and a back-to-the-future linking of medieval and Renaissance verse to a racialized popular culture would, as scholars like Jacques, Michael North, Ann Douglas, and Alden Nielsen in their various ways note, become standard operating procedure of many of the so-called high modernists. Now, the most arresting and most remembered aspect of the poem is, of course, Dunbar's metaphor of the mask. It may seem obvious, but appropriately enough, this metaphor and its relation to the logic of the poem is more complicated than it might first appear. After all, the speaker of the poem identifies with a we who feel compelled to mask our true identities and true emotions from the world. Yet there is a sort of game of doubling in this revelation of concealment. The speaker weirdly stands outside him or herself, describing the existence and something of the nature of the mask that he or she as part of the we wears. Or does he or she really stand outside? How is that possible? On the other hand, is it not a contradiction for the speaker to proclaim that the world never really sees us, only the disguise we put on, since this naked exposure would seem to involve a lowering of the mask, unless the revelation about the mask is a mask? Is the mask something willingly assumed as a sort of camouflage protection, or is it imposed from the outside, or both, a la Ralph Ellison? Given the inescapable connection of the metaphor to the practices of minstrelsy and the vaudeville stage, is the mask a stylization of Negroes assumed by white people that is in turn adopted by African Americans in the era of the coon song, consumed by white and black Americans, further setting the rules of recognition for the representation and recreation of black bodies, voices, and culture that challenges and constrains African American artists, and on and on and on. In other words, there is an endless regress in which the possibility of a double consciousness is asserted, but without the comfort of any absolutely stable or authentic, if you will, features or boundaries. This contradiction between concealment and revelation resembles that of Du Bois's notion of the veil and a double consciousness that prevents or inhibits genuine African-American self-reflection and self-consciousness while provoking endless introspection about the nature of the self and identity. In many respects, Dunbar's version of double consciousness here may be more active than Du Bois's metaphor of the veil. It allows Dunbar to indirectly assert his superiority of understanding to white readers. As in Langston Hughes's clearly Dunbarian opening in his 1951 lyric sequence, Montage of a Dream Deferred, the metaphor of mask makes the act of concealment and its coerced motivation underpinning militant and historically pointed criticism. That's sure, I'm happy. Take it away. Also, as Gavin Jones points out about Hughes's jazz band in a Parisian cabaret, the vacillation between voices in Hughes's poem, like the wider oscillations between vernacular and standard English in James Weldon Johnson's 50 Years, Hughes's The Weary Blues, and Sterling Brown's Southern Road, was in fact a continuation of work already begun by Dunbar. Dunbar then suggests a way of reading African-American minstrelsy and other forms of African-American popular culture, as well as his own, that continues to be influential in our own time. The metaphor of the mask invites or challenges us to change the way we read the poems, say The Party, which might seem to be squarely in the minstrel plantation tradition of lampooning a stylized black dandyism. Again, the recessive nature of masking in the minstrel and minstrel-derived theatrical tradition that Dunbar invokes and draws on lends itself to this sort of reading. The familiar minstrel figure of the ridiculous black dandy is, again, in its origin, a white artist who adopts the mask of a Negro, attempting unsuccessfully to don the mask of high white fashion and diction with allegedly hilarious results. The ironies of such humorous doubled and redoubled maskings obviously presented enormous possibilities for the African-American vaudeville performers and Dunbar through an inherent slippage or instability about where the joke might lie, which gave these performances their uneasy charge. Dunbar's dialect poetry and his framing of it in a strangely negative way, as Professor Warren pointed out this morning, also helped African-American poets imagine a distinctly and more authentic Negro literature aimed at a black audience. Such appeals to black insider authenticity, of course, have a long history and are often, in fact, a form of advertisement to a non-African-American audience. One, you might see this in Howells's claim that Dunbar's brilliant and unique achievement was to have studied the American Negro objectively and to represent him as he found him. Dunbar himself may have had something of this notion in mind when he claimed to James Weldon Johnson that he began writing black dialect poetry because he believed that he could write it as well, if not better, than anybody else. However, as Johnson observed, the notion of writing a black literature that made the declaration of a break with minstrelsy and the plantation genre a prominent feature, expressing authentic self to a black audience rooted in that authentic black culture, is something different from the vision of Howells, even if we might find it problematic. This notion of the relation of African American writing to black culture and a black culture to mass culture visions of black culture proposed a dialectic in which the work of black writers would be continuously proposed against existing representations of black folk and their alleged speech and culture, constantly striving for greater and new authenticity even against their earlier work. Dunbar split between real and mask in his vision of a consciousness that is doubled and redoubled practically ad infinitum in the sort of appropriations, reappropriations, reappropriations, and so on of African American culture and the black subject that lie at the heart of American popular and high culture, all under the sign of authenticity, remained a potent paradigm for the new Negro era with its concern for representing authentically the racial and national self without being imprisoned by the implicitly or explicitly racist expectations of white readers' actual potential, or of the variously accommodationist black readers. Dunbar's foregrounded use of what Johnson called the stereotype properties of the minstrel stage not only suggested new ways of reading high and popular culture, but also provided a sort of baseline of artistic representation of the black folk and black culture against which the folk artists, as Johnson termed them, could demonstrate their greater authenticity, as well as providing other sorts of writers, say County Cullen, another sort of baseline against which they could measure their distance from the popular culture appropriations and misappropriations of black bodies, voices, and culture in the long era of Jim Crow and beyond. In short, Dunbar's poetry, rooted in the peculiar moment of Jim Crow's triumph, anticipates and influences modernist and postmodernist concerns with fragmentation and wholeness, deracination, and a return to an authentic folk or popular spirit, and the relationship of some notion of the folk or the people to mass culture that was of enormous influence on writers in the first half of the 20th century, and in fact continues in many ways to speak to us in our own time. Thank you.
The clock's being reset. It's wonderful to be here. I'm going to talk about Paul Laurence Dunbar's poetic engagement with the Civil War, but I'm also going to look at the Haunted Oak, which might not obviously be speaking to the Civil War, but it serves my purposes. And I suppose I'm going to skip over some of the biography because Joanne Braxton's wonderful opening paper ran through some of that, the kind of the influence that may have been felt by Dunbar given his own father's experience. Okay. In this paper, I'll focus on Dunbar's poetic treatment of the Civil War and its legacies. It's my contention that in this engagement, which involves the exploration of heroism, patriotism, citizenship, proper gender roles, violence, death, mourning, and trauma, the poet is able to give voice to experiences, positions, and protests that would otherwise be circumscribed. In reflecting on the war, considered a worthy and elevated national theme, Dunbar found an acceptable yet powerful way to set black suffering alongside white, to testify to African-American contributions and sacrifices, to figure a form of haunting bound up with the sin of racial slavery, and to pass comment on the disappointments and abuses of the post-Reconstruction era. I was astounded at the wealth of poetry. The more I looked for poems on the Civil War, the more I found. I'm afraid I'm only gonna touch on 3 or 4 poems. I'll see how I get on. But these would include When They Listed Coloured Soldiers, The Coloured Soldiers, The Unsung Heroes, Robert Gould Shaw, and, as I said, The Haunted Oak. The subjects of slavery in the Civil War are treated explicitly in the dialect poem When They Listed Coloured Soldiers. Here Dunbar creates the powerful first-person voice of an enslaved black woman whose beloved, Laius, joins the Union Army to fight for freedom. The poem is centred on drawing out a parallel between white and black experiences of war, but also, in association with this, dominant gender constructions and their relation to racial identity. Indeed, gendered behaviours and codes are, in this instance, key to the claim to black citizenship and personhood. The poem's form consists of regular long lines and rhyming couplets, but also relies upon a familiar and black vernacular voicing, all of which lend to the crafting of the warmth and naivety of the speaker. The narrative sequence is quite strong and takes us from Laius's enlistment and departure to battle, through the experiences of the women left behind, both black and white, to their response to loss and mourning. The repeated line, When They Listed Coloured Soldiers, centres our attention on the decision to let blacks join the Union ranks during the Civil War. It, in addition, simultaneously makes us aware of their previous exclusion from the fighting forces, the white perception of their unreliability, both with arms and in face of danger, and also the non-admittance of black men into a particular mode of masculinity. Laius's enlistment hence signals both a pressing desire to obtain liberty for his people and entry into a male military sphere bound up with ideals of honour, duty. It's the slave's conscience, we're told, that calls him, strength, valour, and sacrifice for a noble, preferably patriotic cause. Laius wishes to fight for the freedom they had given him and the glory of the right, but the pride felt by him and the speaker too, is too tied up with his uniformed and parading appearance, so strong and mighty in his coat of soldier blue, as indicative of newly marshalled masculine attributes, including bravery and physical power, as well as efficient participation in a disciplined and regulatory order quite different to that of slavery. The significance of this induction is reinforced by the speaking persona's emotional and bolstering cry of "Step up, Manny," and her later drawing of an equivalence between the departure of her Confederate master and that of Laius. And this drawing of the equivalence dismantles dominant gender constructions. The fate of Laius laid to rest in southern soil, with the flag that he had fit for shining there across his breast, confirms his place as war hero, his alignment with a suitably loyal form of American nationalism, and perhaps most importantly for Dunbar here, his rightful claim to full citizenship, if before doubted or unrecognised, now proven by his sacrifice. I didn't set out to think about gender quite as much as I ended up doing in looking at this poem, because I found that the other key focus really was obviously the speaker's own position and identity as a black female, which is explored in relation to white womanhood as represented by the mistress and her daughter. Dunbar sets alongside each other their respective experiences of loss when male partners or relatives leave to fight in the war. In women of both races, we find a mixture of pride and grief at their men's enlistment and an emphasis on the capacity for true feeling. When the master and his son first leave, despite her expression of sympathy, the slave woman is denied understanding of her white superior's distress. She herself can only speculate on the women's emotions. She says they only seemed more prouder, and is informed that, as a slave, she cannot fully empathize. I didn't know those feelings is the very words they say. However, when Laius enters into a masculinized role as combatant and hero, the black woman too participates in conventionally gendered behaviors, promising to be true in a sentimental farewell, enduring his absence as a kind of sacrifice with a stricken heart, and eventually weeping and mourning at the passing of her loved one. Now the loss of the dead, whatever their allegiance, is felt through and through, or through and through. If here we witness the speaker gaining access to a sphere of feminine empathy, right feeling, and suffering that contests the view of slaves as lacking human sensitivity or fully realized interpersonal bonds, Dunbar perhaps goes further, positioning her as possessing a more comprehensive and more refined capacity for understanding than the featured representatives of white womanhood. Her voice contributes to the sincere and heartfelt nature of the poetic enunciation, just as her persona's cry to her soldier is all the more choked and charged with emotion as it comes from a throat both sore and raw. The poem concludes with a black woman's compassion for her mistress's loss, an apparently unreciprocated response, and her subversive ascendancy to a contemporary feminine ideal is furthered by a gracious grief that can accommodate, even take solace in renunciation of a beloved in the service of a greater cause, framed as both patriotic and religious, what God had called him for. The burial of Laius with the respect due a military hero, with the flag, as mentioned, stands in contrast to the roadside abandonment of the young master's body and the shameful return of the old master, broke for life, just as the speaker's closing empathy and ennobled feeling, as I mentioned, her compassion for the mourning of others. So just as her closing empathy elevates her above the limited sensibility and sensitivity of the mourning white women. I'm now coming on to a kind of a cluster of poems that take a slightly different approach, I suppose, but the concern with masculinity continues. I'm going to talk about the coloured soldiers and probably summarise my thoughts on the unsung heroes. The preoccupation with the participation of ex-slaves in the Civil War and concomitant celebration of black male bravery can be further witnessed in the longer poems The Coloured Soldiers and The Unsung Heroes. In both of these, Dunbar rejects dialect for a more standard voicing on the need for song to commemorate heroic deeds and sacrifice. The earlier poem, The Coloured Soldiers, employs a first-person speaker, suggestive of Dunbar himself, that using the direct address, you, implies a white audience. For example, of black volunteers commenting, "In the early days, you scorned them." Recounting the initial dismissal of a black role in the white man's battles, the subsequent distress of the nation, the vigorous responses of the coloured soldiers to the Union call, and the lifeblood of their thousands spent to obtain freedom, the poem can be read as a straightforward paean of praise. Yet Dunbar incorporates in the tribute a forceful cry for contemporary recognition and equality, as well as subtle constructions of colour and masculinity. The Coloured Soldiers appears to establish a familiar symbolic opposition between white and black, between polluting dust, the funeral pile of war, and the depths of slavery's night, and on the other side of that, the light of day and freedom. Their muskets flashed the dawning, and they fought their way to light. Yet the poem's imagery proves more complex, and I would suggest invokes a second, somewhat different opposition between colour and whiteness. The actual word white is used only in the second stanza in the context of blindness to the potential of black troops. Colour, in contrast, is implicitly present in the flags and standards under threat of being dulled by dust and defeat, in the skin of the African-American forces themselves, and in the fiery imagery of battle, blazing breach, hot wrought spirits, etc. The use of unblanched in the fourth stanza to describe the black soldier's bravery too works powerfully in the poem, associating colour with valour and paleness, even white identity, with fading, fear, and perhaps also a rather unmasculine form of weakness. This inverts, if only temporarily, dominant codifications of manhood and race, and the final flushed colour imagery of blood that has cleansed completely every blot of slavery's shame further disrupts expectations, as bloodshed causes not a stain, but rather is able to wash away the mark of the oppressive white institution. Dunbar's call for racial equality is also lent force by an unusual invocation of the commingling of blood, perhaps more commonly associated with the taint and threat of miscegenation, yet here cited as part of a patriotic vision of brotherhood on the battlefield, the lifeblood of both blacks and whites having soaked into and enriched the southern soil. Indeed, the poet argues that having shared ordeals and losses during the war, having once ranked as citizens and soldiers, surely blacks have earned civil rights and recognition in the post-war period. He pointedly asks, presumably of a white northern audience, they were comrades then and brothers. Are they more or less today? Thus rendering this song heroic of unequivocal contemporary relevance. In the longer paper, I look at the unsung heroes as again echoing that concern with black agency, courage, and blood sacrifice, focusing on proof of previously doubted manhood. The unsung heroes, though, doesn't make the leap to the contemporary in quite such a forceful manner. It remains in the past tense, and as I said, lacks perhaps the radical gesture of the earlier poem. Okay. Turning to Robert Gould Shaw, this I suppose we can read as being a poem that bitterly condemns the current situation, and again it's slightly different in terms of being addressed to the white leader, and marks out different, or at least on the surface being addressed to the white leader himself, marks out different territory, rejecting a more kind of a celebration of black achievement and bravery in terms of a bleaker portrait of waste. And again, you find that kind of shift in tense that I outlined in terms of the coloured soldiers, because who at the speaking voice moves from asking of Shaw why he leaves academia to a kind of a contemplation of the current situation as this hot terror, this endurance, i.e. Locating us very firmly in the present moment, charting a continuity. Shaw is said to have died, rather than just saying Shaw has died. The formulation have died is used. So I'll leave that there and move to my last poem. In the Haunted Oak, Dunbar employs the ballad form to treat not war, but the theme of lynching. Here we find the violent racial tensions and abuses of the late Reconstruction era explored through the powerful figure of a damaged roadside oak tree. The poem's construction involves a complex layering of voicings and addresses that renders a movement from the particular to a national form of trauma and haunting. The central image is that of the withered bough from which an innocent man was strung up by vigilantes. Although the poem employs few explicit racial markers, we are told that the guiltless victim was charged with the old crime. a phrase which, within the loaded lexicon of race relations in America, implies his rape as a black man of a white woman. As charted elsewhere, one of the provocative elements of the poem is Dunbar's exposure of the lynchers as figures of authority and responsibility within the white community, the judge, the doctor, the minister, and so on. But what interests me is the mechanisms through which the haunted oak achieves its forceful effect. These involve recourse to notions of the uncanny, evocation of physical sensation through the oak tree, and bodily disruption. The oak is a Gothic site bearing the ongoing curse of a past atrocity, a marker of violence and death still imbued with the power to trouble and disturb. Indeed, the tree itself is encoded with history, as it bears witness to the final terror and pain experienced by the wronged man. This is wrought through a kind of substitution or equation of corporeal forms, as the oak, in particular the bough used in the hanging, not only feels the abrasion of the rope against its bark, as if against skin, but also shudders with the victim's gurgling moan and last throe, as the touch of its own last pain. So the figure of the tree does not merely stand as a haunted gallows site, but actually speaks to the damage suffered, the physical sensation, so emblematizing a broadly shared wound, or more broadly shared wound. And just to sort of sum up here, key to this is the question of voice. For most of the poem, the oak tree speaks in the first person. The oak tree itself speaks for the majority. Within this, we have the reported speech of the lynchers who lie, and that throws into relief the truthful nature of the oak tree's own unusual telling. Its account, unlike those of the judge, doctor, and minister, can be trusted, can give voice to experiences that have now been silenced. Yet in the first stanza, we're introduced to a bypasser, another speaker. This speaker, we assume, addresses the tree and becomes the tree's addressee in the telling of the tale. In the final stanza, the poem returns to this frame speaker who has himself been affected by the story of the blighted oak, and this time addresses not the tree, but an implied wider audience, including the reader-listener. So in that last stanza, we find an outward gesture. No longer is the tree addressing the bypasser is addressing us. This voicing, I contend, constitutes a rhetorical device that renders complicit and haunted an entire nation. The movement from an intimate dialogue to a more public bearing witness becomes the kind of the key strategy here. Okay, I've been told to stop, so I'll sum up. The subject of the Civil War is a recurring one for Dunbar, and for me it's one that opens up a significant space for black voicing and critique. I've described quite a variety of different techniques, either the drawing of paralleling between black and white experiences, or, and sometimes that's played out through gender, the call for contemporary recognition and protest, and sometimes the outworking of a wider form of haunting, as that final poem gestures to the reader. We all become complicit within that crime of the lynching, and I'll stop there.
As I feel already the pressure of Professor Yarborough's clock, let me just begin. On December 6, 1898, Richard Coleman's mother came to gather his ashes in Mayville, Kentucky, from beneath a sapling that had been chosen as his execution site weeks before. Surrounded by more than 2,000, this trusted employee of James Lashbrook was whipped, stabbed, dragged, and finally bound to a tree. Indicted for allegedly lynching his female employer, Coleman's murder stallions among countless lynched Americans, blacks whose dying would be enumerated within the daily list posted on the front pages of the Richmond Planted. and whose deaths precipitated a more than 50-year anti-lynching movement that would end without federal prohibitions against mob violence, without substantive reparations for victims' families, and without jurisdictional changes that might yield impartial trials in the federal court system. 9 months earlier, Ohio's anti-lynching bill was struck down by the state Supreme Court in a case brought against assailants Click Mitchell. By the following year, Ohioans would read of North Carolina's Black congressional representative George H. White's attempts to pass a bill placing lynching under the jurisdiction of the federal court system. Without state or federal recourse, Ohioans like Dunbar would read in 1904 of a child lynching attempted by 3 white children against a black boy, days after a public lynching that led to the burning of black residential and business sections, militia occupation, and which threatened martial law and race war. Dunbar's short story, The Lynching of Jude Benson, underscores what has remained underread within the historiography on lynching, namely the relationships among scientific technologies, socio-medical discourses, and legal constructions of evidence in the production of black criminality. Yet as Dunbar's writings demonstrate, the effects of this collaboration not only corporately enhanced, significantly legitimated, and further reified an exhaustive repertoire on black pathology. Rather, these representations of black crime became contingent upon and offered as their perverse byproduct an assumed white female victimacy. And although these two categories are intimately connected to the question of political, social, and economic access underwriting lynchings, they remain relevant in their persistent expression in contemporary restorative justice and victims' rights movements, and in a juridical system that arguably racializes legal presumption. Told from the perspective of an assailant, The Lynching of Jude Benson tracks a physician, Dr. Melville's murder of his trusting friend, the Negro Jude Benson. Eliciting the tradition of the folk novel, this story of murder, what Ralph Ellison would place under the heading of Negro misfortune, is a frame narrative that recapitulates and structures our attention to the narrative motif, modes of enframement. And while it opens as a testimony casually shared by a physician to 2 men seated in a library, it is a story that insists on being read on at least 3 registers: legal confession, as lynching account, and as a romance. Melville's recital of Jude Benson's hanging seemingly follows the familiar discursive protocols of fictional and non-fictional lynching reports. Benson's death was precipitated by the lethal and undoubtedly sexual assault of Melville's paramour, Annie Daly. Part of the radicality of this text rests in Dunbar's calibration of lynching in relation to colonial governance. Dunbar's story dramatizes and dilates our understanding of Anne Stoller's domains of the intimate, the microphysics of colonial rule, whose regulatory effects are realized through the instrumental force of medicine and law. Dunbar highlights the cultural dis-ease and the medical apparatus of disease, lethally affixed to the black body, by indexing his accounting of serial murder, which lynching invariably is, within not simply the space of a romance, but a romance confessed by a physician whose criminal act significantly succeeds a typhoid epidemic, from whose effect Jude Benson ironically remains immune. The proximity of these moments, lynching as a crime of passion that occurs in the aftermath of disease, echoes Dunbar's prescription of the Negro problem as a social malaise. He would write, "It would seem that the man who sits at his desk in the North and writes about the troubles in the South is very apt to be like a doctor who prescribes for a case he has no chance to diagnose." Dunbar's proscription of a prescription for an ailing America anticipates and reflects Du Bois' shared understanding of the Negro problem as, quote, a vast sore that requires, quote, a social surgery at once the delicatest and nicest in modern history. This reading of the Negro problem as social malaise is no easy nominalization, for unless we forgive segregation as an occasion of socially, legally, and economically enforced intracolonialism, a moment whose force amplified in the ratification of Plessy versus Ferguson, a case privileging the role of blood quantum in the legal classification of race, then we risk apprehending the medically inflected colonial curvatures of this domestic moment. The practice and politics of exhibitionism celebrated in the Columbian Exposition of 1893, a fair visited by roughly half of what was then the U.S. population, and included the anthropologic dioramas of Franz Boas, the father of visual anthropology, and organizer of the fair's widely popular anthropologic treatments and live exhibits of Native Americans. Unsurprisingly, Dunbar, who attended and worked at the fair, would find himself in a space that featured not only anthropology and ethnology, but that would showcase Alphonse Bertillon's Bertillonage. Founder of the statistical method Boas used during the fair to collect and publish anthropologic data on the half-blood Indian, Bertillon's anthropometry was a classificatory system developed in 1882 to identify and index criminals based on head and body measures, visible markings, and personality characteristics. Amidst the corpus of forensic techniques emerging in the mid to late 19th century, Bertillon invented handwriting analysis, ballistics, and galvanoplastics for footprint preservation. The inscriptional moment of Dunbar's story is marked then by the emergence of increasingly probative technologies in forensics and in medicine, methods and instruments mutually impacting legal understandings of and procedural rules regarding evidence, while helping to secure categories of racial, criminal, sexual, and psychological difference. It is the moment of Lombroso's work on the criminal man and the prostitute, of Hans Gross's 2-volume handbook on criminal investigation, of the X-ray, of Pearson's formula in forensic anthropology, of the identification of human blood groups in forensic immunology, of Peterson and Haynes' textbook of legal medicine and toxicology, and of Sutherland's primers for doctors and lawyers alike on bloodstain detection. And it is because of this rapid proliferation and transformation in scientific instrumentation and in racialized evidence that Dunbar's enframement of lynching in terms of medicine is critically relevant. Arguably the first institutionalized method for criminal profiling and among the earliest occasions of criminal databases, Bertillonage foregrounded the apprehensive capacities exhausted within 19th century race sciences. Within Bertillon's criminal profile indexing, the heading Negro effects what Hortense Spiller's name signifying property plus. It is radically demonstrative in the sense of testamentary and evacuative. It shares nothing. It empties meaning. In a gesture singularly validating one spectrum of racialized understandings over another, Bertillon offered these instructions to police officers for handling the Negro, and this is what's on the handout that's circulating. When the peculiarity of color is connected with the ethnic or race origin, this latter indication then becomes the primary element of the whole descriptive signalment and should be placed on the dotted line which precedes the heading of descriptive information. Examples: pure Negro, Negro greatly or slightly, cross Chinese, Japanese, cross of Kanaka, and European. Although Dunbar does not take up Bertillon's anthropometry or forensic photography, he does trace the delimiting effects of these empirical systems, shifting our attention to microscopy and to the flesh as a species of evidence. Thomas Dixon opens the fourth book of The Klansmen with double murders, the deaths of 37-year-old Mrs. Lenore and her daughter Miriam. Reserving this chapter and these opening murders to display the emergence and architectonics of the Klan, Dixon enframes the violence we anticipate in the pages that follow within the lens and practice of microscopy. I cite Dixon's text here not simply because of its circulatory breadth, its significance as a cultural icon, or for its repertoire on blackness as Spiller's shady ideal, but precisely because of the underread syntax of lynching and signs that it places at the crux of Klan violence. Following the discovery of these women's bodies at a cliff, Ben Cameron carries them back to his father, the physician, Dr. Cameron, for microscopic examination. The elder Cameron promises that the dead women's eyes, under magnification, will bear the impression of their murderer. Dixon would write, "Impressions remain in the brain like words written on paper in invisible ink. So I believe of images in the eye if we can trace them early enough." The results of Cameron's microscopic experiment promptly convict and induce the lynching of the alleged Negro rapist and murderer Gus. Captivated by its scopic effects, the text tells us that Dr. Cameron beheld on the magnified retina of Mrs. Lenore, quote, the eyes of the bestial figure of a Negro. In The Lynching of Jube Benson, Dunbar anticipates the relationship between science and lynching, mooring Dixon's Klansman, a novel published within a year of Dunbar's death. If one dares to posit a symmetry between these two texts, it may singularly rest in their shared sensitivity to the role forensics played in the criminalization of the black male body and in warranting racial biologisms. That black, and now I'm referring to the top part of the handout. The dying speech fragment of Dunbar's murdered Annie captures the problem of evidence impacting the black body, whose guilt before the law Dunbar claims is a fixed legal presumption. Gaining the area on the floor where her prostrate body lay bleeding, Dr. Melville anxiously hopes to glean the name of Annie's murderer. She was beyond my skill, and my will merged with theirs. One thought was in our minds. Who? I asked, her eyes half open. That black. She fell back into my arms dead. We turned and looked at each other. The mother had broken down and was weeping, but the face of the father was like iron. It is enough. Jube has disappeared. Annie's final words wield an evidentiary role, serving as a legal complaint and an indictment of her assailant. Her eclipse line calls attention to the syntax structuring scenes of alleged racial violence and remarks upon the ways in which blackness simultaneously inhabits the space of the inarticulable and the thickly misunderstood. That her inchoate statement is read as sufficient, it is enough, speaks at once to the negligibility of her victim's testimony and the exhaustion of race in the sense of both fatigue and plenitude within the American unconscious. The fracture here cues the idiomatic linguistic break held within racial encounters, capturing the veritable collapse and condension of meaning around blackness, a collapse precipitated not simply because of death, but rather because of the spectral force of racial epistemes. Annie's father is right then when he says, Jube has disappeared. As racial epistemes supplant testimony, the trusting Negro friend shifts shape, a movement Dr. Melville attributes to tradition. Jube is now menacing, skulking, and diabolical. Immediately following Jube's lynching and the discovery of the actual assailant, Dunbar offers his most explicit exegesis on the intersections between science and law, a conjunction that suggestively marks the site of black exhibition. Recalling both the uses of flesh as relics, souvenirs, and the fleshly character of evidence whose collection realizes indictments, convictions, and punishments, Dunbar concludes his story with the vengeful lover transformed back to clinician. Here, Dr. Melville testifies. In the excitement, they had not yet washed or laid Annie out. Carefully, I searched underneath her broken fingernails. There was skin there. I took it out, the little curled pieces, and went with it to my office. There, determinedly, I examined it under a powerful glass and read my own doom. It was the skin of a white man, and in it were embedded strands of short brown hair or beard. Writing in the aftermath of the 1919 Paris Peace Conference that it was the criminalization of blackness and not black crime that was the problem, Du Bois posits what Dunbar symbolizes by his locative enframement of this, a framed story told by a physician in a library. Blackness and criminal guilt are interchangeable in interdependent social categories. To the extent that Bertillonage, Lincoln's Sanitary Commission, medicine, anthropology, criminology, psychology, and microscopy colluded in the production of the race criminal type, the indictment properly owed lynchers transferred to its victims. Discipline, practice, and the accumulated race epistemologies they collectively signify were as lethal to the black body as rope, pole, fire, and lash. In a story that pivots on a crisis in information, might we not imagine these library shelves surrounding Dunbar's Melville as filled with the text that Dixon's Dr. Cameron reads in order to trace the Negro killer, the very books lining shelves of Poe and Doyle's colonialist detective fiction? Jube is framed. He is framed not simply because his story is told within another, because his story is filtered through his killer, but because what we can see and consequently know of him remains delimited. To the extent that the frame marks the black body as exclusively presence, hypervisible, and operates as an exclusionary instrument, it is repressive. And yet this phenomenon, Maurice Wallace's spectrographia, is resolute, enduring, and historical. It is, according to Dunbar, the problem of tradition. In a moment of self-deprecation, Dr. Melville asked, "Why did I do it? Why did I lynch him? I do not know. It's tradition." At first I was told that the black men would catch me, and when I got over that, they taught me that the devil was black, and when I had recovered from the sickness of that belief, here were Jube and his fellows with faces of menacing blackness. There was only one conclusion. The black man stood for all of the powers of evil, the result of whose machinations had been gathering in my mind from childhood up. Having cast the problem of knowledge and enunciative possibility under the heading of tradition, Dunbar challenges us to think critically of our libraries, namely our cultural histories and the rituals and their potential work as instruments of Foucauldian governmentality. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Shirley, Meta, Arnold, and Gavin for the invitation to come out here. It's always a pleasure to return to Stanford. My, my title, the first portion of my title should appear in quotations as the quote, the sentence is taken from the essay Representative Negroes by Paul Laurence Dunbar, which appears in a 1903 volume, the title of which is The Negro Problem, which included, as many of you know, contributions by Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, Charles Chestnut, Thomas Fortune, and a few others. Representative American Negroes, the essay from which the title of this talk is taken, offers in its first paragraph a rather straightforward description of representation. Dunbar writes, "To have achieved something for the betterment of his race, rather than for the aggrandizement of himself, seems to be a man's best title to be called representative." Setting aside for a moment its moral and hortatory content, Dunbar's description makes logical sense as an account of representation. In order to count as representative, something or someone must stand for something or someone other than himself or itself. When a sign is interested only in itself, it ceases to represent or to be referential. Considered narrowly, then, Dunbar's definition of representativeness would not require any class entailment, anyone at any moment, by seeking to be for someone other than for him or herself, might indeed become representative. Nonetheless, I'm sure it comes as almost no surprise that almost all of the figures in Dunbar's essay, which include, again, Washington, Du Bois, and several others, and not only men, but women as well. Mary Church Terrell is also included among the list of representative Negroes. That almost all of the figures in the essay, with the possible exception of one Bernard Taylor and Robert Smalls, are members of the turn-of-the-century black elite. And it takes no more than a second reflection to realize why this is so. Not only is it easier, once one has achieved some measure of economic stability, to be for something other than for oneself, but it is also the case that one mark of bourgeois class consciousness is indeed the attempt to define that class's narrow self-interests as coterminous with those of society at large. Also demanding some exploration here, though, is why for Dunbar the period of Reconstruction comes in for significant vilification. That is, as the title of the talk says, some men are born great, some achieve greatness, and others live during the Reconstruction period. And Dunbar's non-representative figures in the essay include the following, quote, "the street corner politician who through questionable methods or even through skillful manipulation succeeds in securing the janitorship of the courthouse." Quote, "half the judges, colonels, doctors, and honorables whose stock cuts burden the pages of our Negro journals week after week." The next is "the rabid agitator who goes about the land preaching the independence and glory of his race, and by his very mouthings retarding both." And finally, "the illiterate and inefficient black man whom circumstance put into Congress." This last figure, Dunbar observes, was, quote, "a representative," but was not, quote, "representative." And while all of these non-representative figures mentioned above are not themselves elected figures, Dunbar makes it clear that it is, quote, the peculiar conditions of the days immediately after the war that have made it necessary to draw fine distinctions between being representative and being a mere representative. The problem of representation for Dunbar, then, is not only a moral, epistemological, and a political problem, it is also a historical problem. If this is so, it might follow that the issue of representation that most concerned Dunbar would not necessarily have been a concern, or at least not in the same way, during the antebellum era, and that it could in fact become a problem only after the franchise and office holding became available to black men. It would not be a misstatement to say that the period of Reconstruction marked a moment of intense innovation in the realm of political representation. For the first time in national history, black men could represent in the political realm, both themselves and black women as well. Also for the first time, and of course more controversially, black men could represent white men and women. And the responses to the 15th Amendment by erstwhile allies of abolition was one of the indications of the controversial nature of the franchise being extended in this way. This period then marked the initial moment when most blacks could be said to have been represented politically at all. The differences between the Reconstruction moment and the antebellum period are so clear that I hesitate even to mention them now for fear of belaboring the obvious. Nonetheless, in order to come to my point, a point that derives from Dunbar's essay, I want to underscore some well-known contrasts. During the antebellum period, aside from the small arenas of black participation in the northern states and elsewhere, and despite the 3/5 compromise in the U.S. Constitution, blacks were not represented politically. Property-owning white males did not have to think of themselves as carrying a proxy on behalf of a fractional majority of enslaved black Americans or as operating through some form of virtual representation of black interests. That is, while antebellum America put forward a host of problems around the question of political representation, such as how could basically one human being represent another, how could one group of human beings represent another group, how could a nation state represent its constituent states, and even how could men represent women. It did not put forward the question of how a white man could represent a black man as a problem of racial representation in the public sphere. Chief Justice Taney's infamous opinion in Dred Scott v. Sandiford highlights the barrier to formulating the problem of representing the black race politically. Taney writes, quote, "The question is simply this: can a Negro whose ancestors were imported into this country and sold as slaves become a member of the political community formed and brought into existence by the Constitution of the United States, and as such become entitled to all the rights and privileges and immunities guaranteed by that instrument to the citizen? One of which rights is the privilege of suing in a court of the United States, in this case is specified in the Constitution." Taney continues, "It will be observed that the plea applies to that class of persons only whose ancestors were Negroes of the African race and imported to this country and sold and held as slaves. The only matter in issue before the court, therefore, is whether the descendants of such slaves, when they shall be emancipated, or who are born of parents who had become free before their birth, are citizens of a state in the sense in which the word citizen is used in the Constitution of the United States. And this being the only matter in dispute on the pleadings, the court must be understood as speaking in this opinion of that class only, that is, of those persons who are the descendants of Africans who were imported into this country and sold as slaves." And as we all know, Taney, having defined the question in this way, determines that a black man has no rights that a white need respect. For the purposes of my argument here, because blacks were defined as outside of the realm constituted by citizenship, it made no sense to consider how whites could politically represent blacks or vice versa. Politically, blacks were not available for representation. Now, in making this assertion, I'm of course sweeping aside myriad qualifications, including not least various forms of recognition that the enslaved with no infrequency were able to wrest from their owners. Nonetheless, the broader characterization holds from the standpoint of the national polity as it was called into being by the U.S. Constitution as framed by the founders. Now, it also goes without saying that black unavailability for political representation during this period did not mean unavailability for representation generally. the minstrel stage, plantation fiction, other forms of popular entertainment, narratives, and social sciences purported to represent the race generally, and were likewise frequently charged, of course, with misrepresenting the race. But it might also be useful here to hazard the formulation that the race was available for cultural, social, and scientific misrepresentation largely because it was unavailable for political representation. And while the performance of black troops during the Civil War, which we've heard referred to in various instances, supported radical Republican claims that black Americans had shown themselves worthy of admittance to the policy and thus worthy of being brought into the realm of representation, the major constitutional changes of the postbellum period were not the result of a dramatic transformation in the non-political representations of the black race, but rather it was the political changes of emancipation and Reconstruction that had altered the terms of representation. And one of the interesting points here is that black freedmen did not come into the polity as a race, but as individuals. That is, the 14th and 15th Amendments did not make political representation available as a function of racial identity. And notwithstanding the historical work showing, I think accurately, that Southern black men and women often viewed the franchise as a corporate matter, an attitude that's also verified in the fiction of the period, the race did not get a vote. Individuals from the race did. What was then lost from the standpoint of emancipation elites was whatever social control, small as it was, it had over those who could represent. Okay, to put this matter in Dunbar's term, the Reconstruction Amendments could make a man a representative without making him representative. Or as Dunbar remarks elsewhere in this essay, when speaking of carpetbagger judges, the politics of the Reconstruction period gave us persons rather than personalities, particulars rather than generalities. Accordingly, misrepresentation in the postbellum era for Dunbar and many of his contemporaries took on a specific character defined by a dyspeptic view of the problems that had beset the period of Reconstruction. What was difficult for elites to stomach was not that false representations, in the sense of unreal or untrue images, were being substituted for true ones, but rather that persons, that is individuals who stood for themselves only, were masquerading as personalities, that is individuals who stood for the race. The non-representative figures mentioned in Representative Negroes were not fictive distortions. They were all too real, which was precisely the problem from Dunbar's perspective. The import then of Dunbar's representativeness, views of representatives, Dunbar's views of representatives have import for both literary critical and historical implications here. In regard to the former, we can consider Dunbar's poem, The Poet, of which Fishkin and Bradley write, is not a persona poem, but which can accurately be read as Dunbar's comment on the public and critical reception of his work. The poem reads, as we all know, he sang of life serenely sweet, with now and then a deeper note. From some high peak, yet not yet remote, he voiced the world's absorbing beat. He sang of love when earth was young, and love itself was in his lays, but the world it turned to praise, a jingle in a broken tongue. The poignancy of this poem for us derives largely from our knowledge of the critical reception of Dunbar's work, particularly the Howells introduction, and from our awareness of the prominence of minstrel performance during these decades in shaping the demand for black expression. And though no critic would read Dunbar's complaint as merely personal, the mechanism by which the personal becomes something more than that is generally assumed about the poem rather than demonstrated. As a result of our knowing what we do about Dunbar's career, it is probably accurate to assume that the he who sang of life serenely sweet is also the same person who writes the jingle in the broken tongue, and that the poem dramatizes the critical preference within a single poet's body of work for one type of poetry over another. Yet it's worth noting that the poem chooses not to make its final line possessive. That is, Dunbar does not write his jingles in a broken tongue, which, though not perhaps quite as smooth as the line with which the poem does end, would still respect the rhyme and rhythm of the verse and would more accurately convey the meaning of the poem, if we assume it is about Dunbar's struggles with readers' preference for his dialect verse. Instead, we get a jingle in a broken tongue. To be sure, this line does not foreclose the likelihood that we are still talking about the work of a single poet, but it does open up the possibility that the contest here is between the poet and some other writer. Or to be more precise, as the poem was written, the poet loses the world's regard, not explicitly to his own jingle or someone else's jingle, but simply to a jingle. The key contrast here is between the final line of the poem and the concluding line of the first quatrain, which is, he voiced the world's absorbing beat. The poet of the first quatrain is representative. That is, he is all about representation. And even if what's being represented is an absorbing beat, the poet is voicing something other than himself, the world's absorbing beat. The final line, by contrast, is non-representative in being simply about itself. It voices or expresses nothing, or if it expresses anything, it's how that line might sound, a jingle in a broken tongue. As a line, it is interested only in itself. The poem dramatizes then the world's choice or election of the non-representative over the representative, as if Dunbar's understanding of the problem of the Reconstruction period was being reenacted in these lines. The problem of the stereotype or mask for the turn of the century elites was not first and foremost a complaint that masks and stereotypes were artificial and thus untrue. Dialect could indeed count as a mark of the real. The matter at issue was whether or not it and those who spoke it could become truly representative. My main claim here is not that Dunbar and his contemporaries always answered that question in the negative, but that the problem of representation they contended with was different from what it had been previously and from what it would be subsequently, if only by matters of degree. When the unnamed protagonist of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man opens that novel by describing the process by which people saw everything but himself, and when Ellison debates Irving Howe about constraints on black fiction, his concern is about something like projection. That is, in the discussions that embroiled Ellison, Wright, Baldwin, and others, the chief problem was the psychological projection of white fears and pathologies onto blacks, and along with that, the problem of internalization by blacks of those stereotypes or fictions as real. By contrast, while notions such as Du Bois's double consciousness do demonstrate that turn-of-the-century black elites were no strangers to the psychological dimensions of living Jim Crow and with a problem of internalization, it is the external political dimensions that may be more illustrative of the working of turn-of-the-century writing. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for conversation. It's kind of glary, so if you hold your hand up, I will identify you, and if the person with the mic, Rhonda, if you could just go where I'm vaguely swinging. Yes.
My name is Henry Blackwell, and I'm from Boston College. I want to ask a question of Professor Davis, I believe, who spoke recently about Jude Benson. You have amassed an enormous amount of material to show that the story is charged with things that could be associated with personal brilliance or being in sync with the times, or there are many grounds on which we could arrive at the idea that Dunbar was a genius. My question is whether whether we should claim genius or coincidence. There are a lot of other things in that story too, such as the social conversation about the relationship between freed slaves or former slaves and white people in domestic situations, for example, when his brother Ben tells Jube that he shouldn't have been friends. But I think this question carries through a number of other things and perhaps touches at least slightly Professor Warren's claims about representation. So, do you think should we claim genius, or should we claim coincidence, or should we claim great competence? Or do we bring to the poet the means by which we manufacture heroes and keep ourselves deluded?
No, I appreciate the weight of that question. It's a hazardous one for me to answer. What I want to say is that this story, like Dunbar, is a measure of his moment. This is a writer, as I read him, who is deeply sensitive to what is going on around him. And it's difficult to read Dunbar and not recognize that in him. I mean, this is a gentleman who understood the significance of the African American press as a key method for carrying through the project of emancipation. This is a gentleman who would write in his letters that we have to protest lynching lest we ourselves become complicit in the project of lynching. And so when I read him, it's difficult not to read his understanding of the significance of science, particularly medicine, that other critics and historians have also noted at this particular moment as a profession that is getting deeply professionalized and that is bearing the weight, particularly in literature, of entertaining questions about the Negro, questions about gender, so that when I speak of science and medicine in this story, I'm speaking of him on par with someone like Charles Chestnut, who also uses the physician as a vehicle to launch an indictment, for example, of the Wilmington race riots, something that Dunbar is also worried about. Du Bois also worried about the problem of science, law, race, and lynching. And so I see him as really acutely aware of the work that science was playing in the production of forms of evidence codifying race as a biological or somatic phenomenon that could be, that was enduring, could not be changed, transferred, altered. I mean, this is also some of the legacies of the Sanitary Commission and the kinds of measurements and studies that it would then produce to help underscore the work and reify the work that was going on in race sciences. So I really do see him as someone deeply aware of his cultural, social, and political climate. And in that sense, yes, extraordinary in the kind of depth. This is a story that has real economy. I'm talking about a text that, depending upon your publication, is probably about 8 pages. And in it, there is so much to think about, among them the relationship that you yourself have articulated.
Yeah, and I don't know that I have a great deal to add on that point, except to say that, I mean, it does seem to me that you know, at this moment, with disenfranchisement becoming indeed the wave of the wave of becoming reality for the bulk of African Americans, one of the things that is a baseline for this elite group really is an awareness of all of the various means through which the consolidation of Jim Crow was being put forward. So, so I don't think it would be accidental that someone like Dunbar would be very much aware of all of the forensic and scientific evidence being mounted against the Negro. I think that indeed what you see across the board is an acute awareness about these issues. So. Whether it's genius or not, it's certainly not accidental, I guess.
Dennis from Youngstown, Ohio, and a student at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. This question is addressed to Jennifer. I appreciated your perspectives on Dunbar's Civil War poems, but my question relates to his visit to England. He was well received in the late 19th century, and he read his poetry before Queen Victoria. Not much has been written about that. Do you know much about it? Can you tell us anything about it? How well he was received, and whether he recited his poetry in dialect or standard verse? And how well is Dunbar known today in England? How well is he received today?
I'm afraid I can't help you out very much in terms of his visit. I probably know the same as you. I wouldn't have. I don't think that. The reading that you mentioned is particularly was not particularly familiar to me. In terms of how well Dunbar's known in the UK at the moment, he's not particularly widely taught. So I guess you'd have to be someone particularly interested in African American literary history to be familiar with his work, actually. So I can answer on that front. In terms of the visit to England, there are probably people in the room better qualified than myself. My citizenship doesn't help me out here.
Well, I just want to say that judging from the papers today, the legacy of Dunbar is in good hands, in the hands of these young scholars that we've heard today. I just am so impressed. So I just want to give a shout out to the young folk in here in this audience. And I want to say, as I was looking at this wonderful photograph of Paul Laurence Dunbar, my mind kept going to Kanye West. Donda West, baby boy. And I want us to just for a moment, and maybe Kenneth and the others can sort of think about this, seeing Dunbar as a kind of 19th century, late 19th century Kanye West. Because let's look at it. He is a young, that's right, he's a young man who didn't go to college, who's being supported by his mother, and really promoted by her. He has those beats. He's known for his beats. But then he has another message. And he's very representative of his generation. And he knows how to get that message to the generation. It goes back to what you asked earlier, Kenneth, about dialect and whether it is an appropriate form, medium. And it is appropriate because, you know, Dunbar knew that he could reach his people through the dialect. And if you understand how he gave his poetry, he often recited it, he performed it. And when he performed it, the party and those things that may seem difficult when we read those poems, when people learned how to recite those poems, they learned because they learned orally. And when his work became very popular, it's because people recited those poems and they were passed on as in the oral tradition. I sort of see Kanye West doing the same thing. It's only when, of course, he starts talking about Bush that he gets into real trouble. And I, of course, really connect with what you were saying, Professor Davis, in the sense that, you know, he had these ideas and he gave his opinion in the poems very subtly, but also in his essays and in his short stories.
I ain't saying he's a... an interesting question. I think the logic of my argument actually requires me to disagree, right, with you in a number of ways. Picking up in terms of the issue of oral performance, one could say that when you think about, say, people like Twain, George Washington, Cable, and the like, I mean, oral performance in terms of going around and reading one's writings and one's dialect writings, of course, was not something that was specific to someone like Dunbar. So I don't think that that would distinguish him in some respects from a style of performance that was more available in broader cultural terms. And again, the logic of my argument would say that while indeed his dialect representations of you know, black peasantry and the like were not, you know, were covered a spectrum in terms of, you know, from ridicule to respect, that the kind of argument he puts forward in the essays, and I think that would be somewhat consistent with positions he takes elsewhere, would be such that representative figures for Dunbar would not ever include, I mean, his essay would not presumably enable him to include many of the figures he represents through the means of dialect verse. So that if one were going to make the the claim about the potential identity of Dunbar and Kanye West, actually it would be, I think, in some respects, to the detriment of what Kanye West understands himself to be doing. But it would also open up a little, an interesting problematic way of reading what the audience for and what the way in which representations of contemporary hip hop or rapper might be doing. So I guess I would have to disagree with you somewhat tentatively, because I don't feel that I'm someone who's on top of the whole of Dunbar's oeuvre. So,
I think you want to keep in mind the recent Rolling Stone cover where Kanye West was represented as the crucified Christ, a certain kind of romantic, suffering artist image, as well as his huge Pepsi contract. But you didn't hear it from me. Yes, right there in the corner.
I have a question for Jim Smethurst. I guess one of the things I liked and appreciated about what you were doing is that in a very short space you're presenting nothing less than a sort of new historiography of late 19th century Afro-American literature based on an idea of historical paradox or ambivalence that then winds up producing ideas about guises and masks and duality, which then winds up producing the forms or tropes of black modernism. Is that somewhat accurate?
Well, I would even go so far as to say maybe modernism. Period.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. One would wonder how Black modernism uses these tropes that are based on a historical experience that itself passes, the experience of the Nadir. And so I'm wondering, under the sort of, I guess, the banner of the Harlem Renaissance and a shift to a new mode of modernity as opposed to modernism, how these tropes of paradox and duality are reinvented.
Oh, gosh, that's a huge question. But, well, one thing I want to say that, I think you could pick up from a lot of what the panelists are trying, all of us are trying to come to grips with today is, when we say the Nadir, it makes it sound like this was sort of like a clearly settled period where, they've been in it for a while. But, you got to remember that Dunbar is somebody who, Jim Crow is really only winning, hasn't even completely won yet while he's writing this stuff. I mean, George White does not leave office in North Carolina until 1901. The Republican populist fusion, black-white fusion government in North Carolina, their power is not really broken until 1900. So they're sort of like maybe one of the last. You could figure out lots of last gasps. Maybe it's when Woodrow Wilson, Jim Crow's the government in 1913, which causes someone like James Weldon Johnson to get out of the government because he sees there's no future. So, one of the things is that Dunbar is trying to figure stuff out. He's trying to figure out a way of representing this weird moment of the rise of Jim Crow, the rise of disenfranchisement, the triumph, really, and the sort of culmination of this long era of violence, but also these weird fascinations, we might say, with African American bodies. So, I think that one of the reasons why we keep talking about ambivalence and duality is because people are trying to figure out, well, who are we, where are we, what are we in this moment? Because it's not at all clear to people. Are you an American or are you not an American? In Reconstruction, there was some answer, which was, yeah, you are. It's not perfect, but things seem to be moving that you might actually think you were a citizen. But 1896, 1898, 1900 especially, Dunbar gets progressively gloomier, and it's partly his health and his emotional life, but it's also where the country's going. It gets different. So where I think they go is I think people think about, Dunbar is sort of the great, is the great forerunner, in my mind, of different techniques, different responses. One is, I think, the radical democratic response that you might see in someone like County Cullen, which sort of echoes what Du Bois says in The Souls of Black Folk. Your country, how came it yours? Which would be, Keats, who gave you John Keats? What kind of weird pseudo-biological claim can you make on John Keats, or say Jim Smethurst can make on John Keats, because you're white? You learned about John Keats exactly the same way that I did, in a book, right? It didn't come down to you through your DNA, somehow. So that there's that kind of, we sit together, and he winces not, Du Bois does, there's a lot of, this dualism. I mean, Dunbar is one person, but he's a very important person. So there's that. Then there's the idea that, well, you say we're black, we're not Americans. Maybe there's something like an African-American culture, an African-American tradition that's somehow distinct from America, which someone like James Weldon Johnson, in his way, will take up, and then others, even more stomped down, hardcore nationalists will take up. Well, he helps do that, and then there's the middle sort of ambivalent zone where he takes from people like Walker and Williams. The African-American kind of vaudeville performers and stuff, which is very, but it suits a very ambivalent time, which is, where's the joke? Is the joke on us? Is the joke on you being white people? Is it on the idea of minstrelsy? It shifts around and you laugh, but no one's ever very comfortable. It's like the Langston Hughes story, who's passing for who, right? No one's very comfortable with it. But I think that, this is also someone, obviously Hughes will pick up on it. Helene Johnson is a great person for doing that kind of stuff, and Dunbar kind of is the forerunner of all that kind of modernism. But I also think if you're thinking about where does fragmentation come from in modernism? Who's the great forerunner in the idea of sort of these, or Toomer, is another person, like split personalities. Well, the sort of alienation, well, Dunbar, and his work is right there. Someone like Eliot won't give him credit, but Eliot will admit very anxiously to his fascination with African American culture, and there's really almost a paranoid fear that the young kid from St. Louis who makes himself into an Englishman of sorts was very nervous early on that he wasn't quite white, not culturally. And as Ezra Pound liked to remind William Carlos Williams, William Carlos Williams really felt he wasn't quite right. I mean, the Carlos wasn't there because of some eccentricity of his family, but it was because his mom was Puerto Rican, and Pound used to say to him, you're not quite American enough to say these things, which is to say you're not quite white enough. I think that Dunbar helped people think about this stuff. I mean, does that kind of answer your question? Or in a kind of inchoate way? Ambivalent, double-voiced way?
Let's have maybe one other final. Yes, Miriam in the back.
Hi there. Again, I really enjoyed these papers very much, and I'm especially struck by what I hear as this sort of oppositional discourse that Dunbar, the comic, and Dunbar, at least dealing with the issue of criminality. I mean, these two very clear moments at this period. So I'm wondering if we could say a little bit more about how, is it cross the genres? That is these two notions. We have the comic and the criminal element coming out in Dunbar, or are we reading one more or less in relationship to poetry and the other primarily relationship to the fiction? So I wonder how much further, for instance, Nicole, you've taken that idea of this moment in some of his other works, because it seems to me there's a lot there when you talk about this moment and the relationship to his awareness of issues of criminality. But again, it's just the difference between the comic side and the criminal side. So,
at this point in my investigations with Dunbar on these questions about the evidentiary, whether it's legal, scientific, sociological, or psychologic, I've been most worried about how he characterized, or not worried, but most interested at this point in how he's characterizing it in his essays and in the short stories. So I cannot speak as carefully or as closely to the poetry, and I don't know if there are others. I mean, I do know that he, of course, engaged the problem of lynching, as Jennifer has shared with us today also in his poetry, and I know that that's present. But whether these issues about crime and the Negro as a criminal figure do come up in the essays, and it's a place where he really talks about the way in which legal presumptions have been racialized, the ways in which this idea of innocent until proven guilty does not work for Black people. It is not an available way to go forward with a prosecution and to enter into a process of adjudication. And so I know that he talks about that very explicitly and carefully in the essays, and I think also in the short stories. But whether in the poetry, in the same kind of ilk, I cannot speak to that right now.
Can I say something, though, about that? I mean, I think that, and that was a tremendous paper, I mean, the stuff that you put out there, that this is also something that's in the culture. Professor Lowe referred to it this morning, especially with the rise of the coon song, and some of the figures from the coon song, which had some of the older, sort of dandy and tramp stereotypes, but also added, as Dorman points out, something new, that this notion of comic and the criminal was something that's out in the culture. One figure very at the same time. In one moment, the figure of the quote-unquote coon with a razor or a pistol, hypersexual, aggressive. One moment you're laughing, one might be laughing at him. One moment you might be projecting this image on somebody who you're hanging, set on fire and castrating them. I mean, that you can go from one this is one and the same. And if you want to see, how bizarrely, how this persists in American culture, check out Emperor Jones if you haven't looked at that lately. Check out that scene when they're in the shooting crap down in Savannah, and the guy, the bad man, Jeff, pulls out a razor and tries to cut up Paul Robeson, cut up Brutus Jones, and ends up being killed. But that's a scene that goes in about a second from these sort of hilarious, allegedly, minstrel stereotypes to all of a sudden you're just like, whoa. And I think that, this was a long way of saying, typically, that Dunbar was responding, I think, to something that's in American culture, this figure that could be menacing and humorous, alternately, or even almost at the same time. It's a very weird country.
Yeah. Well, and I think the extent to which the Dunbars we've seen today, the myriad Dunbars, speak to contemporary culture. I mean, what you're just describing sounds like 2006 in terms of representation of black comedy, especially urban comedy of a certain kind, and the intense criminalization of the entire black community at this moment. So Dunbar, once again, speaking across the century to issues that we're still wrestling with. I know this happens hopefully at good conferences. I hope that you've had this experience before where the more conversation you have, the more questions and the papers start to concatenate. In other words, the connections, they start to pile on top of each other. And unless you're just too exhausted from partying tonight, I think this will pick up tomorrow, and hopefully the papers will continue to speak to each other. I'd like to thank the speakers from today's panel. Please join me in giving them a round of applause. I also want to thank all of the speakers from the other panels. We've got a great set of very smart, very provocative papers, and I also want to thank all of the speakers on behalf of the organizing committee for being such good sports. It's much easier being the timekeeper than it is dealing with such a ruthless limit, and I just know how hard it is, and I just hope you understand that it hurts me more than it hurts you. Thank you very much.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Stanford University. Please visit us at stanford.edu.